Picture a shed so vast it could swallow a cathedral. 700 feet long, 180 feet wide, 158 feet from floor to roof. Steel doors at one end that weigh 470 tons each and need electric motors just to open them. Step inside and the air is cool and still, a held breath. It smells of doped linen and metal polish, of welding flux and engine grease, and somewhere beneath all of that, something else. Something faintly animal. Something old. That smell is ox intestine. We'll come back to that. This is Cardington, Bedfordshire. The year is 1929, and inside this shed, nearly 1,000 men and women are building the largest flying structure the world has ever seen. Her name is R101. She stretches 731 feet from nose to tail, longer than 2.5 football pitches laid end to end. Her diameter is 131 feet, her height 140. Stand beneath her and she blocks out the sky. She is, in every sense, a sky palace, a floating monument to an empire's belief that it can conquer the air itself. We bring back the days when the journey meant just as much as the destination, the ships, the trains, the stories worth remembering. If you'd like to come along for the ride, subscribe. We've got more of these waiting for you. Now let's continue. And what an empire it was. Britain in the late 1920s still commanded a quarter of the world's land surface. India, Australia, Canada, South Africa, Egypt, colonies, dominions, protectorates, a global network held together by telegraph cables, civil servants, and the slow, reliable rhythm of the steamship. By sea, India was 17 days away. Australia, 5 weeks. Letters took even longer. Governing an empire at the speed of sail was becoming, in the age of the telephone and the wireless, increasingly absurd. Someone had to think bigger. And aeroplanes. In 1929, they were still small, deafening, bone-shaking machines that needed to refuel every few hundred miles. A passenger aboard an Imperial Airways flight to India would endure multiple stops, multiple transfers, multiple days of noise and vibration. The wealthy didn't fly, they sailed. But what if you could fly to Bombay in 5.5 days in comfort? What if you could do it with a dining room, a lounge, promenade decks with windows? What if you could cross the world, not in the belly of a shuddering biplane, but in something that felt like a gentleman's club drifting through the clouds? That was the Imperial Airship scheme. And for a few extraordinary years, it seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The idea first surfaced at the 1921 Imperial Conference, when Alfred Ashbolt, Agent General for Tasmania, proposed an Imperial Airship Company. A Conservative MP named Denistune Burney shaped it into a formal plan. 6 airships, built and operated by Vickers, linking London to the furthest reaches of empire at a cost of £4 million. The planned route would carry passengers, mail, and the intangible cargo of imperial prestige from England to India in less than a week. But when Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government came to power in 1924, the new Secretary of State for Air had a different vision entirely. His name was Lord Thompson, and everything that follows, the beauty, the ambition, the catastrophe, circles back to him. Christopher Birdwood. Thompson was born in 1875 in Nasik, India, to a military family. Educated at Cheltenham College and the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, he was cosmopolitan, charming, and fluent in French. During the Great War, he served as military attaché in Bucharest, where he fell deeply in love with Princess Marta Bibescu, a married Romanian author of considerable fame. It was a devotion that would last the rest of his life. A colleague once encountered Thompson hurrying down a London street in civilian clothes, carrying a delicately tinted pair of gloves, on his way to address a trade union meeting. Thompson laughed and said he knew he didn't look much of a trade unionist, but that couldn't be helped. He was, in other words, a romantic, a man of gestures and passions, of grand visions pursued with aristocratic confidence. Thompson didn't want Vickers building the future alone. He wanted a competition. 2 airships. One built by private industry, that would be R100, contracted to a Vickers subsidiary at Howden in Yorkshire. The other built by the government's own Royal Airship Works, right here at Cardington. His airship. The People's Airship. It was an explicit experiment. Could the state match or beat private enterprise? The press quickly gave them nicknames. R100 became the capitalist ship. R101 became the socialist ship. And for the next 6 years, 2 teams of brilliant, stubborn engineers raced each other toward the sky. The planned fare tells you everything about who this service was for. £150, single, to India. That's roughly £8,500 in today's money. This was first-class ocean liner territory. Diplomats, officials, the wealthy, the kind of passengers who expected crystal on the table and someone to learn their name by the second day. And the timing couldn't have been more electric. In August 1929, Germany's Graf Zeppelin completed a round-the-world flight in just 12 days. 250,000 people greeted it in Tokyo. In London, a football cup final stopped mid-match while it drifted overhead, players and spectators alike staring upward in wonder. Airships weren't curiosities. They were the future of long-distance travel. They had 72 cumulative years of operating experience. Aeroplanes had 16. The great Hugo Eckener, commander of the Zeppelin fleet, captured it perfectly. You don't fly in an airship, you go voyaging. Can you imagine the excitement? A world looking up and believing, truly believing, that these enormous, silent, beautiful machines would carry civilization forward. But there was a shadow falling too. By the end of 1930, British unemployment had doubled to 2.5 million, 1 in 5 of the insured workforce. The Great Depression was tightening its grip. The Imperial airship scheme was becoming a prestige project the nation could scarcely afford, and prestige projects, once begun, develop a momentum of their own. Powerful men had staked their reputations. The schedule would not wait. The rivalry between R100 and R101 was more than a competition between airships. It was a contest between worldviews, between the disciplined economy of private enterprise and the ambitious, open-funded reach of the state. And it attracted extraordinary talent on both sides. R100, the capitalist ship, was designed by Barnes Wallis, a name that would echo through the century. This was the same Barnes Wallis who would later design the geodetic structure of the Wellington bomber and, most famously, the bouncing bomb that breached the Merna and Eder dams in 1943. But in the late 1920s, he was simply a brilliant, exacting structural engineer with a gift for elegant simplicity. His chief stress engineer was a quiet, meticulous young man named Neville Shute Norway, who would later become one of the best-loved novelists in the English language, writing as Neville Shute. His novels, A Town Like Alice, On the Beach, No Highway, would sell millions. But first, he sat at a desk in a drafty hangar in Yorkshire, computing the stress loads of airship girders by hand. Each transverse frame required 2 to 3 months of painstaking calculation. He did the work himself, hour after hour, because there was no one else, and because the budget allowed no shortcuts. That budget was the key to everything. Vickers worked under a fixed-price contract that punished waste and rewarded efficiency. Every pound spent on experimentation was a pound that couldn't be spent on proven solutions. So Wallis designed R100 with an engineer's ruthless elegance. 11 standard types of girder, no more. Proven Rolls-Royce, Condor petrol engines that worked reliably and weighed what they were supposed to weigh. Simple cable and wheel steering, no experiments, no untested technologies, just sound, conservative engineering within a budget that would not bend. R101's team, freed from those constraints, took the opposite approach. Under Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Richmond, known to colleagues as Dope for his obsession with cellulose varnish, the Royal Airship Works attempted something far more ambitious. Multiple untested technologies all at once. Heavy diesel engines instead of petrol, because hydrogen's explosive nature made petrol's low flash point genuinely dangerous, especially on a tropical route to India where temperatures would soar. A novel stainless steel framework. New gas bag arrangements with servo-controlled valves. Power-assisted steering surfaces instead of simple cables, where R100 used a steering wheel, R101 used electric servo motors. Where R100 stuck with engines that worked, R101 gambled on Beardmore Tornado diesels, enormous 8-cylinder machines with 84 litres of displacement that arrived from the factory both overweight and underpowered. Richmond wasn't foolish. The innovations he pursued were genuine advances, and diesel really was safer near hydrogen. But he was attempting too many firsts simultaneously, on a ship with no margin for error, on a schedule driven not by engineering readiness, but by political necessity. As NASA's later case study concluded, R101 was a classic schedule-driven technology disaster. And then came the moment that sealed R101's fate, not with failure, but with someone else's success. On July 29, 1930, R100 departed Cardington and headed west across the Atlantic. She reached Montreal in 78 hours and 49 minutes. Canada went mad for her. 100,000 visitors a day lined up to tour the ship. In Quebec, folk singer La Bolduc composed a satirical song about the public's airship obsession. The Montreal Gazette hailed R100 as a triumph of British engineering. She returned to England in just 57 hours and 56 minutes, 21 hours faster than the outbound trip. Neville Shute would later write about 100 Rand with quiet pride, but he also understood what the triumph meant for the other team. 100 Rand's success didn't ease the pressure on 101 Rand, it crushed it. The socialist ship had to fly now and fly well, or the entire argument for government-built airships would collapse. Careers would end, the scheme would be abandoned. Lord Thompson's dream of arriving in India aboard his own creation would die in a hangar in Bedfordshire. The pressure was immense, and pressure, applied to engineering, has a way of bending judgment until it breaks. Let's step inside. You don't board R101 from below, as you might expect. You approach from a mooring mast, a 200-foot tower rising from the Bedfordshire countryside. You walk along an enclosed gangway that extends from the masthead to the airship's nose, and you step through into a long corridor panelled in white and gold. The walls aren't wood or plaster, they're doped linen, fabric stretched over frames of balsa wood covered in thin metal sheeting. It looks solid. It looks like the corridor of a country house hotel. But tap it with your knuckle and you'd feel the give, the hollowness. Everything aboard R101 is illusion layered over engineering necessity. Stage scenery, suspended in hydrogen, designed to make you forget you're inside a machine and believe you're inside a building. The smell is distinctive. New fabric, the sharp, chemical tang of cellulose dope, the lacquer used to tighten and waterproof the outer covering, a faint, metallic note from the aluminium fittings, and beneath it all, if you know what you're noticing, something organic and ancient, the musty scent of gold beater's skin. Those gas bags, 16 of them, after the ship was lengthened, each one 10 stories tall. They held 5.5 million cubic feet of hydrogen, enough in theory to lift the entire structure and everything in it into the sky. And they were made from the outer membrane of the caecum, the blind gut, of oxen. The manufacturing process was older than flight itself. Intestinal membranes, roughly 2 feet by 10 inches, were shipped from Argentine slaughterhouses to Cardington in 5-gallon buckets. At the works, they were cleaned in mild alkaline solution, scraped with a blunt knife, stretched over frames and dried. When two sheets were laid together, wet and rubbed, the living tissues fused as they dried, creating seamless, hydrogen-proof joints without any adhesive. 7 layers were laminated together and glued to a cotton fabric backing. Each ox provided roughly 1 square foot of usable membrane. The estimates of how many animals contributed to R101's gas bags range from 500,000 to 1.5 million. The women who prepared and assembled these membranes worked with extraordinary care and skill. The gas tightness of the entire ship depended on their hands. But we were walking through the corridor. Let's continue. 3 steps down from the entrance corridor bring you to the lounge, and here you stop. You have to stop because the scale is unexpected. 5,500 square feet. Larger than the ground floor of most houses, larger than many hotel lobbies. White panels with gold inlay on the walls. Wicker chairs and settees upholstered in fabric, their cushions inflated with air instead of stuffing. A weight-saving measure so clever that passengers would never notice. Writing desks along the walls stocked with stationery headed in the R101 crest. Aviation paintings hung in frames. 30 people could sit here in comfort, reading, writing letters, watching England turn slowly beneath the windows. 3 steps up from the lounge and you're on the promenade deck. Windows run along both sides of the ship, originally glass, later replaced with lightweight chelon to save a few precious pounds. Cambridge blue curtains hang ready to be drawn at night, so passengers can gaze down at the darkened landscape without interior light spoiling the view. And what a view it would have been. At 1,000 feet, R101's typical cruising altitude, you're close enough to see individual houses, to follow the bends of a river, to watch a farmer crossing a field. Church steeples rise from villages below. Trains move along silver rails. It's not the distant, abstract experience of modern air travel, where the world below looks like a map. This is intimate, personal. You're floating through the landscape, not above it. The ground is close enough to feel real. The dining room was designed to seat 60. Meals ran to 5 and 6 courses, served on aluminium cutlery, not silver, though the original plans had called for it, stamped with the Royal Airship Works crest. The galley was entirely electric. No gas burners, no open flame, not anywhere aboard a ship filled with hydrogen. The all-electric oven and vegetable steamer were innovations born of absolute necessity. The kitchen staff included a chief steward, an assistant steward, a cook, and a galley boy, the youngest crew member aboard, a lad named Thomas William Megginson. He was 18 years old. He had told his parents he had always wanted to fly on an airship. And then, remarkably, impossibly, there was the smoking room. A smoking room on a hydrogen airship. 24 seats located on the lower deck, 2 full stories below the nearest gas bag. The floor was light asbestos, laid over a thin metal sheet. The ceiling was asbestos. The walls were metal-covered cloth. A single electric lighter, secured to the wall by a short cord, was the only source of ignition in the room. No matches, no cigarette lighters, no candles, nothing. Every person entering was checked. The room was a sealed, fire-proofed capsule, a pocket of controlled risk inside a vessel that could not tolerate an uncontrolled spark. It sounds mad, but it worked. The smoking room was used on every flight, including the last one. Foreman engineer Harry Leach was sitting in it, alone, smoking a cigarette at 2 on the morning of October 5th, 1930, when the ship went down. The sleeping cabins were modest, 2-berth and 4-berth arrangements, rather like railway sleeping compartments. Narrow, functional with curtains for privacy. Originally there were 50 cabins, but by the time R101 made her final voyage, 12 double-berth cabins had been stripped out, sacrificed to the relentless arithmetic of weight that haunted the ship from her first flight to her last. What strikes you, walking through R101, is the contradiction at its heart. Everything looks substantial. Everything projects confidence. The lounge, the dining room, the promenade, they speak of imperial permanence, of a world where standards matter and comfort is not negotiable. But behind the white and gold panels, there is nothing but fabric and air. Above the asbestos ceiling of the smoking room, there is nothing but gas. And beneath the entire beautiful illusion, there is a framework of stainless steel that weighs 23 tons more than its designers intended. R101 was a palace built on a margin that didn't exist, and the people who built her knew it. Here is where the story darkens. And it darkens not with a single dramatic failure, not with a bolt of lightning or a sudden explosion, but with the slow, grinding, remorseless arithmetic of weight. R101's designers had specified a structural weight not exceeding 90 tons. The actual airframe came in at 113.6, 23.5 tons over target. At the same time, the gross lift, the total upward force the hydrogen could generate, fell short of predictions by more than 3 tons. Design said 151.8 tons. Reality delivered 148.5. Do you see what's happening? The ship is heavier than planned and lifts less than planned. The margin, the gap between what the ship weighs and what it can carry, is being squeezed from both sides. The original design called for 62 tons of disposable lift. That's the weight available for fuel, water ballast, crew, passengers, cargo, food, luggage, everything that makes an airship useful. After all the overruns, R101 had barely 50, and it got worse. On the route to India, the air over Karachi would be hot, thin. Hydrogen lifts less in warm air. The tropical conditions would cost another 11 tons of gross lift, which meant that in India, R101 might have had as little as 27 tons of disposable lift. Not enough for a commercially viable airship. Barely enough to fly at all. Where did all the weight go? The engines were the worst offender. Those 5 Beardmore Tornado diesels had been specified at 2,200 pounds each. They arrived at the factory weighing 4,773 pounds, more than double. Each engine installation, with its mounting car and systems, exceeded 3 tons. 5 of them contributed roughly 17 tons to the airship, 6 tons over budget. The aluminium crankcases had cracked during development, forcing a reversion to heavy cast iron blocks. Torsional resonance above 950 revolutions per minute meant they could never run at their designed maximum. The power-to-weight ratio was atrocious, over 8 pounds per horsepower compared to just over 2 for the best contemporary aircraft diesel. The framework was heavier than planned. New Air Ministry safety regulations had added structural mass. The tail surfaces exceeded their weight estimates. Everything, everywhere, weighed more than the calculations had promised. So the engineers began to cut. 2 toilets were removed, saving roughly 130 pounds each. A hot water tank was taken out. 1 radiator. Glass windows were replaced with lightweight cellon. 1 entire set of promenade windows was removed from one side of the ship. Reefing booms were stripped away. Servo mechanisms were deleted. 2 water ballast tanks were eliminated. The original silver cutlery became aluminium. Wicker furniture replaced heavier alternatives. Cushions were inflated with air instead of being stuffed. 12 sleeping cabins were pulled out. Total weight saved from all these measures, roughly 3 tons. 3 tons gained back from a deficit of nearly 12. It was like bailing the ocean with a teacup. And then someone had an idea. What if you made the ship longer? R101 was taken back into the great shed, separated at the midpoint, and a new bay 46 feet long was inserted, stretching her from 731 feet to 777. A 16th gas cell of roughly 500,000 cubic feet was added. This delivered approximately 9 more tons of lift, but it added another ton of structural weight, and it introduced a problem that would prove fatal. To squeeze even more lift from the existing cells, engineers loosened the wire harnesses that held the gas bags in place, allowing them to expand and fill more of the available space inside the hull. Squadron leader Michael Rope, who had designed the harness system, protested. He understood what would happen. The expanded bags would press against thousands of exposed bolts, nuts, taper pins and sharp-edged fixings on the steel girders. Every shift of wind, every gust, every pitch and roll of the ship would cause the delicate gold beater's skin, those painstakingly laminated layers of ox membrane, to chafe against metal. On July 3rd, 1930, Air Inspectorate Inspector F.W. McWade wrote a devastating letter that bypassed his immediate superior to warn of exactly this. The gas bags, he reported, were hard up against the main longitudinals and rubbing very hard on the nuts of the bolts. The fouling points, he wrote, occur throughout the ship and amount to thousands. Holes were already appearing. Cloth padding had been wrapped around the protruding fixings, but McWade was withering. The padding becomes loose, and the projection complained of is again exposed. His memo was forwarded to Wing Commander Colmore, who sent back a reassuring reply. The matter was taken no further. McWade's warning never reached Sir John Higgins, the Air Council member responsible for airship safety. Chief Designer Richmond himself, the man who had built R101, calculated that gas bag leakage might cause 4 to 5 tons of lift loss in just 12 hours of flight. On a ship already skating along the edge of its margins, this was catastrophic. 4 tons of unexpected lift loss in bad weather at low altitude at night. The consequences were predictable. But the numbers were noted, filed, and overridden by something more powerful than engineering. Lord Thompson had a schedule to keep. There is a particular kind of courage, quiet, private, desperately conflicted, that belongs to people who see danger clearly and walk toward it anyway. Not because they're reckless, but because duty, loyalty, professional pride, and the weight of expectation leave them no way to step aside. R101 was full of such men. First Officer Noel Atherstone, grabby to his friends, kept a secret diary. It wouldn't be discovered until 1967, nearly 4 decades after his death. His entry from November 6, 1929, reads like a controlled scream of frustration. All these window-dressing stunts and joyrides before she has got an airworthiness certificate are quite wrong, but there is no one in the Royal Executive who has got the guts to put their foot down. His final entry before departure was quieter, and somehow worse. Everybody is rather keyed up now, as we all feel that the future of airships very largely depends on what sort of a show we put up. He was 36 years old. He knew the ship wasn't ready. He flew anyway. What choice did he have? To refuse was to end his career, to betray his crew, to admit that everything they'd worked toward for years was a failure. So he wrote his fears in a diary no one would read for decades, and he climbed aboard. Captain Herbert Carmichael Irwin was 36 as well, a tall, sensitive Irishman who had commanded airships R-33, R-36 and R-29 with distinction. He'd been a member of the British Olympic athletics team at the 1920 Antwerp Games. He lived with his wife at Putney Lane in Bedford, and on the evening of October 4th, 1930, as R101 lifted from the Cardington mast and turned south toward London, the ship passed directly over his house. He'd been on duty since before 6 that morning, managing departure preparations and attending to VIP passengers. He would have very little rest before the crash, 11 hours later. A captain's burden is always the heaviest, and Irwin carried it without complaint. Chief Coxswain George William Skye Hunt 41 years old, married, 3 children, had earned his nickname and the Air Force Medal during a famous incident in 1925 when airship R-33 broke loose from its mooring mast in a howling gale and drifted helplessly over the North Sea. Hunt had been among the crew who fought for hours to bring her back, and the experience had made him something of a legend in airship circles. According to those who knew him, Hunt said goodbye to his family on the evening of October 4th, as though he did not expect to return. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scene. It was simply the quiet gravity of a man who understood risk and had made his peace with it. The story, and it should be noted that this comes from later accounts and cannot be verified with certainty, is that after the crash, Hunt survived the initial impact, walked calmly into the switch room, and said to the men there, "We are down, lads." And then, by some accounts, he went back into the burning wreckage to find his friend, Assistant Coxswain Wally Potter. Neither of them survived. Air Vice Marshal Sir Sefton Branca, the Director of Civil Aviation, was among the passengers. He was 63, a lean, energetic man who had made his first flight in 1910, served with distinction in both the Boer War and the Great War, and spent the last decade championing British aviation with tireless enthusiasm. He'd encouraged cities to build municipal airports, lobbied for new air routes, spoken and written ceaselessly about the future of flight. He would die aboard R101 on the 20th anniversary of his first time in the air. There are suggestions, fragmentary based on later testimony, that Branca harboured private doubts about R101's readiness. But he was a public servant. He was expected to fly, and so he did. And then there was the youngest man aboard, Thomas William Megginson, the galley boy, 18 years old. He'd been thrilled to get the posting. He had told his parents, with the earnest, uncomplicated excitement that belongs to 18, that he had always wanted to fly on an airship. He would never fly on anything else. Lord Thompson, meanwhile, radiated confidence. At the House of Lords in June, he had declared, "There is going to be no risk while I am in charge. No lives will be sacrificed through lack of foresight and skill." Before boarding R101 on the evening of October 4th, he told waiting reporters that the ship was as safe as a house, except for the millionth chance. His personal luggage weighed 254 pounds. Crew members were restricted to 15. Among Thompson's effects were 2 cabin trunks, 4 suitcases, 2 cases of champagne, a 3-pound dress sword, his valet, 20-year-old James Buck, and a Persian carpet weighing 129 pounds. The carpet was reportedly a gift connected to Princess Marta Bibesco, the woman he had loved across decades and distances. He had written to her just weeks before, "To ride the storm has always been my ambition." That carpet weighed almost exactly what the 2 toilets removed during weight-saving modifications had saved, 130 pounds each. Think about that for a moment. Let it settle. Engineers had stripped the ship of toilets, literal necessities, to save a few £100. They had removed sleeping cabins, radiators, water tanks, servo mechanisms. They had replaced glass with plastic, silver with aluminium, stuffing with air. They had shaved ounces from every system they could reach. And here was Lord Thompson, loading a 129-pound carpet and 2 cases of champagne onto a ship that could not afford the weight of a second bathroom. It is, in miniature, the entire tragedy of R101. The collision between engineering reality and political vanity. The weight of prestige, measured in pounds and ounces, pressing down on a ship that could not bear it. The certificate of airworthiness had been issued just 2 days before departure, on October 2nd, despite the fact that R101 had never completed full-speed trials. She had never been tested in rough weather after her extension. The National Physical Laboratory had not finished its aerodynamic analysis. The final trial flight, on October 1st and 2nd, had lasted just 16 hours and 51 minutes in near-ideal conditions, cut short when an engine oil cooler failed. R101's total test flying amounted to roughly 127 hours, almost all of it in fair weather. She wasn't ready. The men who flew her knew she wasn't ready. The inspector who examined her gas bags had written a letter saying she wasn't ready. The designer who built the harness system had protested that she wasn't ready. The first officer had recorded in a secret diary that she wasn't ready. But the Imperial Conference waited for no airship. Lord Thompson had an empire to impress, and the schedule, that merciless, immovable schedule, could not be delayed. 54 people climbed aboard R101 on the evening of October 4th, 1930. 37 crew, 5 officers, 6 Royal Airship Works officials, 6 passengers. Among them, a cabinet minister, a knight of the realm, a designer who climbed into the rigging at 2 in the morning because he knew something was wrong, a coxswain who said goodbye as though he meant it, and a galley boy who had always wanted to fly. None of them had to be there. All of them chose to go. And at 6:36 on a cold, wet October evening, under spotlights and fine rain, before a crowd of thousands who had come to see the great ship off, R101 backed away from the Cardington mooring mast and turned her nose toward France. The rain was already falling as R101 pulled away from the Cardington mast. Squadron Leader Booth, commander of R100, the sister ship, the Rival, watched from the observation gallery at the top of the mooring tower. He was an experienced airship man, and what he saw troubled him. As R101 backed out of the cone at the masthead, her bow should have risen. Instead, it dipped. Captain Irwin gave the order, and water ballast, tons of it, sprayed out into the darkness, catching the spotlights in a cascade that one observer described as 1,000,000 tears, falling like a fountain from some fairy tale. Booth estimated 2 tons of ballast discharged from the nose, another ton from midships, a further ton jettisoned as the engines opened up to full power. 4 tons of water, gone before the ship had even cleared the mast. 4 tons that could not be recovered, that would not be there later if they were needed. R101 steadied herself, found her trim, and turned south. The 5 Beardmore diesels settled into their rhythm, a deep, low-frequency pulse that passengers in the lounges above would barely feel. The engines hung in external nacelles, far below the passenger accommodation, separated by the enormous acoustic buffer of the gas-filled envelope. This was nothing like the roaring, vibrating experience of a 1930s aeroplane. This was something closer to the hum of a cathedral organ felt through the floor. A distant reassurance that the machinery of flight was doing its work somewhere below and behind, leaving you in peace. By 7 o'clock, barely half an hour into the flight, an oil pressure problem was reported in the aft engine. At 7:16, it was shut down. R101 would fly the rest of the night on 4 engines. The ship crossed London at roughly 800 feet, passing over Alexandra Palace, the Metropolitan Cattle Market, Shoreditch, the Isle of Dogs, and the Thames at Greenwich. It was dark and raining, but Londoners came out to watch. How could you not? This vast illuminated shape drifting overhead, 777 feet of lit windows and engine hum, moving with a stately silence that no aeroplane could match. From the ground, she looked like a floating building, a hotel in the sky, the future, passing over the rooftops of the present. Near Hitchin, the wife of Shane Leslie looked up and saw R101 pass directly over her house. She later said the ship was so low, it seemed as if it couldn't miss the roof. She could see the people dining through the windows. She could see the electric bulbs in the ceiling. The engines, she said, seemed weak and unbusinesslike. She was watching 54 people eat their last meal. Inside, the atmosphere was warm. The dining room was lit softly. The distinguished passengers, Lord Thompson, Sir Sefton Branca, the Director of Airship Development Reggie Colmore and the others, sat down to an excellent supper. 5 courses, aluminium cutlery bearing the Royal Airship Works crest, an electric oven humming in the galley, young Thomas Megginson, the galley boy, moving between the kitchen and the table. Conversation, cigar smoke drifting from the smoking room below, the gentle vibration of 4 diesel engines carried through the structure like a heartbeat. At midnight, the wireless operator sent a message back to Cardington, one of the last the ship would ever transmit. It paints the scene in a few spare, evocative words. After an excellent supper, our distinguished passengers smoked a final cigar, and having sighted the French coast, have now gone to bed to the sound of an engine room telegraph. The French coast. They'd crossed the Channel. They were over France, headed south toward Paris and beyond, toward the Mediterranean, Egypt, the Persian Gulf, and India. The journey of a lifetime, unfolding in the quiet hours of an October night. Most of the passengers were asleep. Lord Thompson had retired to his cabin with its Persian carpet and champagne. Branca was in bed. The crew moved through their watches with professional calm. At 2 o'clock, the routine mid-watch changeover, Second Officer Maurice Steff came on duty, relieving the first watch officer. Steff was 34, a veteran of the Battle of Jutland, but the least experienced of R101's 3 watch officers. The changeover was orderly, unhurried. No alarm had been raised. No emergency had been declared. This was routine. The height coxswain held the ship at roughly 1,500 feet. The wind had picked up, a southwesterly gusting to perhaps 50 miles per hour. Rain beat against the outer covering. Ahead, invisible in the darkness, lay the Beauvais Ridge, 770 feet of high ground, notorious for turbulence. Captain Irwin had gone to rest. First Officer Atherstone, the man with the secret diary, was off watch. The ship was in the hands of the night crew. Everything was proceeding normally. Everything was about to end. At approximately 7 minutes past 2, on the morning of October 5th, 1930, something went wrong in the forward section of R101. We will never know with certainty exactly what happened first. The Court of Inquiry would later conclude that the most probable cause was a sudden loss of gas from one of the forward gas cells, almost certainly the result of a tear in the envelope, or a catastrophic failure of the outer covering on the upper nose, likely caused by the same chafing that Inspector McWade had warned about 3 months earlier. Thousands of exposed bolts, nuts, and taper pins. Goldbeater skin rubbing against steel in the rain and wind. The covering split, gas escaped, and the nose, suddenly lighter than the tail, dropped. R101 went into a long, steep dive, approximately 18 degrees nose down. Engineers were thrown off their feet. Furniture in the smoking room slid forward and piled against the bulkhead. In the engine cars, slung beneath the hull, men grabbed for handholds as the floor tilted beneath them. The height coxswain, whose name and face we do not know because he did not survive, did exactly what training required. He put the elevator hard up, fighting to bring the nose back to level. And it worked. For perhaps a minute the ship steadied. She came back to roughly even keel. There was a moment, a terrible brief moment, when it seemed as though the crisis might pass. Then the second dive began. Same steep angle, shorter duration. And this time, there was no recovery. R101 struck the ground, nose first, at the northwest edge of the Bois de Coutume, a small wood near the village of Allon, roughly 2 miles south of Beauvais. The impact speed was approximately 13.5 miles per hour, no faster than a bicycle. For anyone braced or seated, the crash itself was survivable. Foreman engineer Harry Leach was alone in the smoking room, the asbestos-lined, fire-proofed capsule 2 decks below the gas bags. He described the impact as more a crunch than a blow. He wasn't even shaken from his seat, but within 2 seconds of the ship touching Earth, everything changed. A blinding flash of fire erupted from somewhere above the control car. Hydrogen, 5.5 million cubic feet of it, had found an ignition source. The gas didn't explode in the conventional sense. It burned. It burned upward and outward with ferocious speed, and the flames, fed by an almost inexhaustible supply of fuel, engulfed the entire 777-foot length of the ship in moments. Eugène Rabouille, a French rabbit trapper who was out in the darkness near the woods, witnessed everything. "The airship," he said, "dipped by the nose several times, and its forward section crashed into the edge of the wood. There was a tremendous explosion that knocked him off his feet. Flames rose into the sky, perhaps 300 feet. Everything was swallowed by fire. He saw human figures running in the wreck, running like madmen. Then he lost his head and ran into the woods." Louis Petit, a storekeeper from the village of Alon, watched from across the parish. He saw something that looked like a lit-up village passing low above the church. Each time the lights came on, the airship dropped a little lower. Then, with all the lights burning, the ship nosedived. There was an explosion. "Something that you cannot imagine," he said. "It was as if the whole world had exploded." 46 people died immediately or in the fire. 2 more, riggers Sam Church and Walter Radcliffe, were pulled from the wreckage alive, but died in Beauvais Hospital. Church's fiancé and his father rushed to France by the fastest route they could manage. They arrived 2.5 hours after he died. 8 people survived the initial crash. 6 lived. All 6 survivors were engineers. 4 of them, Arthur Bell, Joe Binks, Alfred Cook, and Victor Savary, owed their lives to the same piece of luck. They were stationed in the external engine nacelles, the pod-like cars that hung below the main hull and were partly shielded from the hydrogen fire above. Joe Binks was 37 years old and he was late. He was due to relieve Arthur Bell in the aft engine car at 2 o'clock. He didn't arrive until 2:03, 3 minutes. It's worth pausing on that. If Binks had been punctual, Bell would have left the engine car and been walking through the interior of the ship when the fire struck. Instead, both men were in the nacelle, below the hull, below the gas, partly protected from the inferno overhead. They felt the 2 dives. They felt the ground rushing up. Their engine car bumped and scraped along the earth in a world of fire, flame everywhere, above them, around them, the heat ferocious. And then a 200-gallon service water tank, mounted above the engine car, burst open, drenching both men and quenching the flames in their immediate vicinity. They crawled out through the wreckage with wet rags pressed over their faces, choking, blinded, barely alive. Binks's tardiness, 3 minutes of ordinary human lateness, saved Arthur Bell's life. Bell was 21 years old. Harry Leach, the foreman engineer who had been smoking alone in the fireproofed smoking room, survived the impact. He was thrown forward against the bulkhead by the first dive. When the fire erupted, the asbestos-lined room gave him a few seconds of protection, seconds that no one else in the passenger areas had. He smashed through the wall of the smoking room, fought his way out of the wreckage, and then, burned, gasping, surrounded by fire, he went back in. Wireless operator Arthur Disley was trapped in the burning structure. Leach found him and dragged him free. For this act, Leach was later awarded the Albert Medal by King George V, one of the highest honours for civilian bravery. Disley, despite severe burns to his hands, insisted on telephoning the Air Ministry from Beauvais to report the disaster before he would accept any medical treatment. He was awarded the O.B.E. Leach's wife had been widowed once before. Her first husband had died in an earlier airship accident. Alfred Cook, 23, survived in his engine pod. He had swapped shifts that night with a colleague who was feeling ill. That colleague, the man whose shift Cook took, did not survive. Victor Savary, 33, also made it out from an engine car. 6 men, that's all. 6 men out of 54 stumbling away from a field of burning wreckage in the French darkness at 2 o'clock in the morning in the rain. And behind them, the ship that was going to carry the British Empire into the future lay broken and burning on a hillside and would burn for hours: the doped linen, the balsa wood, the fabric, the wicker furniture, the Cambridge blue curtains, the gold beater's skin. All of it feeding a fire that could be seen for miles. Lord Thompson's Persian carpet, his champagne, his dress sword, the stationery with the R101 crest, Thomas Megginson's galley, Sky Hunt's switch room, Atherstone's secret diary, though somehow it survived, charred but legible, to be discovered decades later. The airship that was too heavy to fly had become too light to save. The news reached London by morning. Britain woke to headlines that seemed impossible. R101, the great ship, the national project, the future, had crashed in France. Lord Thompson was dead. Sir Sefton Branker was dead. Nearly everyone aboard was dead. The public mourning that followed was extraordinary, not just in its scale, but in its solemnity. This was not merely an accident. This was the death of a dream. The airship age, which had seemed so certain, so imminent, so magnificent, had ended in a field near Beauvais. In France, the dead were honoured with a gravity that still moves. The bodies were transported on artillery caissons through the streets of Beauvais, past thousands of silent onlookers escorted by Spahi cavalry, the French army's tribute to Britain's fallen. More than 100,000 spectators lined the route from Beauvais to Boulogne. The French understood loss on this scale. They had buried a generation in the fields of the Somme and Verdun, not 15 years before. In London, 48 coffins were brought to Westminster Hall, the ancient heart of Parliament, where kings had lain in state. Each coffin was draped with a Union Jack and bore a plate fashioned from R101's own aluminium. Only 14 bore names. The rest said simply, "To the memory of the unknown airman who died on October 5th. Nearly 90,000 people queued to pay their respects. The line stretched half a mile through the London streets. Westminster Hall was kept open until 35 minutes past midnight to admit them all. A memorial service at St Paul's Cathedral was attended by the Prince of Wales and Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, the same MacDonald whose government had launched the Imperial Airship scheme 6 years earlier. On October 11th, a mile-long cortege wound through crowded, silent London to Euston Station. The coffins travelled by train to Bedford, then by road to St Mary's Church in Cardington, the little parish church in the shadow of the great airship sheds, where R101 had been built. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 48 men were buried in a mass grave. An RAF squadron flew overhead. 3 volleys were fired by the Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire regiment, and then the village of Cardington, where nearly everyone had known someone aboard, was left to its grief. The Court of Inquiry was led by Sir John Simon and opened on October 28th. 10 days of testimony followed, including evidence from Dr. Hugo Eckener of the Zeppelin Company, the most experienced airship commander in the world. The final report, published in March 1931, delivered a judgment that was devastating in its restraint. The most probable cause was a sudden loss of gas from a forward cell, likely caused by failure of the outer covering. But the deeper truth was captured in a single careful sentence. It is impossible to avoid the conclusion that R101 would not have started for India on the evening of October 4th if it had not been that reasons of public policy were considered as making it highly desirable for her to do so. Reasons of public policy. That was the inquiry's way of saying politics killed this ship. On August 31st, 1931, the Cabinet abandoned British airship development entirely, and then they did something that still astonishes. R100, the successful ship, the proven ship, Barnes Wallis's masterpiece, the capitalist ship that had flown to Canada and back without incident, was deflated, dismantled, flattened by steamrollers and sold for scrap. For less than £600. It had cost £450,000 to build. It had crossed the Atlantic twice. It worked. And they crushed it because the political embarrassment of continuing the airship program, of flying 100 Rand while 101 Rands dead lay in Cardington churchyard, was more than any government could bear. Neville Shute never forgot. He never forgave. The experience shaped his writing for the rest of his life, and his memoir, Slide Rule, remains one of the most quietly furious accounts of bureaucratic failure ever written. The Zeppelin Company purchased 5 tons of duralumin from R101's wreckage. There is a persistent, unverified belief that this metal ended up in the structure of the Hindenburg, which itself would burn 7 years later in front of newsreel cameras at Lakehurst, New Jersey. Both Cardington hangars still stand. If you drive through Bedfordshire today, you can see them from miles away, enormous angular silhouettes against the flat countryside. Shed number 1, where R101 was built, was used as recently as 2016 by hybrid air vehicles for the Airlander 10 prototype. Proof, perhaps, that the dream of lighter-than-air flight never entirely died. Shed number 2 has found a different kind of afterlife. It's leased by Warner Brothers as Cardington Studios and one of the largest indoor spaces in Europe. Batman Begins was filmed there, Inception, Rogue One, Fantastic Beasts. The shed that once held a sky palace now holds other kinds of dreams. At St Mary's Church, the memorial stands in the churchyard. It was designed by Sir Albert Richardson and paid for by public subscription. £1,398 raised, penny by penny, from a grieving nation. A stone tomb chest on a 3-tiered base inscribed with all 48 names. The scorched RAF ensign, recovered from R101's tail, hangs inside the church nave. It is quiet there. The kind of quiet that belongs to places where something enormous happened and then stopped. Near Allon, France, a memorial erected in 1933 stands beside the road. Somewhat neglected now on a busy route, with nowhere to pull over and park. A smaller marker sits at the crash site itself, on private land. The owner keeps the ground clear. Grass grows where hydrogen burned. And that brings us to the question that has echoed through 95 years of aviation history. The question that makes R101 more than an accident report, more than a list of engineering failures, more than a footnote to the more famous Hindenburg disaster that would follow 7 years later. Why did they fly? They flew because an empire expected it, because a cabinet minister had staked his reputation on arriving in India aboard his airship, because careers depended on success and no one could afford failure, because the certificate of airworthiness had been issued, and once it was issued, refusing to fly was an admission that the certificate was worthless, because the rival ship had already succeeded, and pride demanded an answer, because the schedule was set, and schedules, once set, develop a gravity of their own, pulling people forward even when every instinct says stop. They flew because the dining room was beautiful and the lounge was grand, and the promenade windows looked out on a world that seemed from 1,000 feet full of promise. Because the smoking room worked. Because the galley boy had always wanted to fly. Because Sky Hunt said goodbye to his family with the quiet dignity of a man who understood his duty. Because Atherstone wrote his fears in a diary and then put the diary away and went aboard. Because Rope climbed into the rigging at 2 a.m. to check the gas bags one last time and found, almost certainly, exactly what he feared. They flew because people do. Because ambition and duty and pride and love and stubbornness and hope are heavier than any Persian carpet, and they press down on human judgment with a weight that no engineer can calculate, and no inspector can measure, and no inquiry can fully explain. R101 cost £603,500 to build. She flew a total of roughly 127 hours. She carried the future of British airship travel and buried it in a French hillside in 2 minutes of hydrogen fire. The era of the Sky Palace died with her, but the sheds at Cardington still stand. And if you visit on a quiet afternoon, if you stand in the shadow of those vast, angular structures and look up, you can almost feel it, the ambition, the beauty, the terrible, magnificent folly of building a dining room in the sky and expecting the sky to hold it up. Almost, but not quite. Some things once lost can only be imagined, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the imagining, the wondering, the wishing, the gentle ache of knowing what was attempted and what was lost, is its own kind of flight. We've talked about what happened to R101. We've talked about the weight, the politics, the fire. But before we go any further, I want to take you somewhere else for a moment. I want to take you back inside, not to the tragedy, but to the experience. Because if we don't understand why people loved airship travel, we can't understand why they were willing to risk everything to preserve it. So let's imagine you're aboard, not on the final flight, on an earlier one, on a calm autumn afternoon, somewhere over the English countryside. The first thing you'd notice is the quiet. Not silence. There's no such thing as silence aboard any machine. But the engines are far away. They hang in nacelles, slung beneath the hull, separated from you by the vast, cushioning volume of the gas-filled envelope. What reaches you is not a roar, not a rattle, but a low, steady hum. A vibration felt more in the chest than heard in the ears. Like the distant bass note of an organ in a cathedral you can't quite see. It's reassuring. It tells you the machinery is working without demanding your attention. You could hold a conversation in a normal voice. You could read. You could think. This is nothing like an aeroplane of 1930. A flight aboard an Imperial Airways biplane meant deafening engine noise, violent turbulence, a cramped cabin that smelled of petrol and oil, and the constant, unsettling awareness that you were sitting inside a small, fragile machine in a very large sky. Airship travel was the opposite of all that. It was spacious, quiet, and impossibly smooth. How smooth? Consider this. Aboard the great German airships, the Graf Zeppelin, the Hindenburg, journalists and passengers left accounts that border on disbelief. A vase of flowers on a writing desk didn't tremble. A glass of water filled to the brim didn't spill a drop. During a mid-Atlantic storm, a Hindenburg journalist reported that sweet peas and carnations in their vases remained perfectly still. The pitch and roll of an airship was so gentle, so gradual, that the human body barely registered them. Elevatormen were trained to keep the ship within 5 degrees of level at all times, because anything more caused passenger discomfort. Not danger, just discomfort. There was no turbulence in any meaningful sense. There was no seasickness, ever. Now look out the window. You're at 1,000 feet. Maybe 1,500. Close enough to see individual houses, gardens, the pattern of hedgerows, the silver thread of a river bending through fields. A church steeple rises from a village below, and for a moment you're almost level with its weather vane. A train moves along a track, trailing a plume of steam. Horses stand in a field, and one of them, you can see this, you're that close, lifts its head to watch you pass. This is not the abstraction of modern air travel, where the earth below is a map, a patchwork of colours without detail or scale. This is intimate. You are floating through the landscape. The world is real and close, and moving slowly beneath you, and there is time, all the time in the world, to watch it go by. The promenade deck windows are large enough to lean against. The Cambridge blue curtains are drawn back during the day. You can stand here for an hour, watching England unfold, and no one will hurry you. There is nowhere else to be. There is nothing to do except look and think, and let the slow turning of the countryside beneath you do whatever it does to the human heart when beauty is given time. At night, the experience transforms. The curtains are drawn so that the lit interior doesn't reflect in the glass, and you press your face close to the window and look down into darkness. Towns glow below like scattered handfuls of amber. A car's headlights trace a road. The moonlight, if there is moonlight, turns rivers to silver and fields to grey velvet. And above you, above the ship, above everything, the stars. An airship at 1,000 feet, 100 miles from the nearest city, floats beneath a sky that most of its passengers have never truly seen. The Milky Way stretches overhead. The stars are thick and close and impossibly bright. There is no light pollution. There is no engine glare. There is just you, and the window, and the night, and a kind of silence that isn't silence at all but is something better. The deep, contented hum of a machine carrying you through the dark while the universe wheels slowly above. Hugo Eckener, the great Zeppelin commander, the man who had flown the Graf Zeppelin around the world, understood this better than anyone. "You don't fly in an airship," he said. "You go voyaging." That's the word, voyaging. Not traveling, not commuting, not being transported, voyaging. The journey was the destination. The experience of being aboard, the quiet, the views, the unhurried rhythm of meals and conversation and sleep was the entire point. You didn't endure an airship crossing the way you endured a flight. You savoured it, and the meals. Let's not forget the meals. 5 courses in the dining room. Breakfast with 40 choices aboard the great German ships, though R101's menu was more modest. The galley humming with electric heat. No gas, no flame, not a spark anywhere. Aluminium cutlery bearing the crest of the Royal Airship Works, catching the light from fixtures overhead. The steward pouring coffee. The gentle clink of cups. And through the windows, the world drifting past at 60 miles an hour. Fast enough to cross a continent, slow enough to watch every mile of it. The smell of the dining room would have been distinctive. Fresh bread from the electric oven. Coffee. The faint, chemical sweetness of the cellulose dope on the walls. The metallic brightness of the aluminium tableware. And beneath everything, if you were sensitive to it, that strange, ancient, faintly animal scent of the gold beater's skin, gas bags, somewhere above your head. The smell of 1,000,000 ox intestines, stretched and dried and fused together, holding 5.5 million cubic feet of hydrogen between you and gravity. You wouldn't have thought about it. You'd have been too busy watching the clouds, or buttering your toast, or listening to the gentleman at the next table describe what he'd seen from the promenade deck at dawn. But the smell was there. The ox guts were there. The hydrogen was there. The beauty and the danger were woven together so tightly that you couldn't separate them without destroying both. That was airship travel. That was what they were trying to preserve. That was what made men board a ship they knew was too heavy, on a night they knew was too rough, on a schedule they knew was too fast, because it was worth it. Because nothing else felt like this. Because when you stood at the promenade window of R101 at 1,000 feet over the English countryside, on a clear afternoon, with the hum of the diesels in your chest and the whole green world turning slowly beneath you, you understood in your body, not just your mind, what human beings had always dreamed of when they dreamed of flight. Not speed, not efficiency, not getting from here to there as quickly as possible. This. Passengers saw the lounge, the dining room, the promenade deck. They saw the steward who poured their coffee and the officer who greeted them at the gangway. What they didn't see, or what they were never meant to see, was the world that made all of it possible. R101 carried a crew of 42 on her final voyage. 37 of them were working crew. Engineers, riggers, coxswains, wireless operators, stewards, cooks. The officers numbered 5, and behind the white and gold panels of the passenger accommodation, above the ceiling and below the floor, and throughout the vast interior of the ship's envelope, these men inhabited a different world entirely. Start with the riggers. Their job was the most physically demanding and the most dangerous aboard. The interior of an airship, the space between the outer covering and the gas bags, was a labyrinth of girders, catwalks, wires and inspection ladders that stretched the full 777 feet of the ship. It was dark. It was cold. The catwalks were narrow, some barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Below them, in many places, there was nothing but the thin outer fabric and 1,000 feet of air. The riggers climbed through this space on every flight, inspecting the gas bags for leaks, checking the wiring harnesses, examining the outer covering for tears or damage. They moved through a forest of steel girders and taut wires, their torches casting shadows that swung and shifted with every movement of the ship. The gas bags surrounded them, enormous, pale, 10 stories tall, pressing against the framework with a soft, insistent pressure. In the dark, in the cold, with the hum of the engines transmitted through the metal beneath their hands, the riggers were closer to the reality of what this ship was than anyone else aboard. They knew it wasn't a building. They knew it wasn't a hotel. They knew it was a fabric-covered framework filled with explosive gas, and they crawled through it, bag by bag, girder by girder, bolt by bolt. It was a rigger's life that Michael Rope was living at 2 o'clock on the morning of October 5th, climbing up into the ship's interior, alone, in the dark, almost certainly inspecting the gas bags. He wasn't on duty. He had no obligation. He climbed because he was worried, because he knew better than anyone alive what those expanded gas bags were doing to themselves every time the wind shifted. The engineers had their own world, the engine nacelles, 5 pod-like cars, each housing a Beardmore Tornado diesel and the men who tended it. Slung beneath the hull on struts, exposed to the weather, vibrating with the relentless pounding of 84-litre cylinders, the engine cars were loud, oily, and cramped. The engineers worked in pairs or alone, monitoring oil pressure, fuel flow, cooling systems, and the endless mechanical complaints of engines that had never quite worked as designed. They communicated with the control car by telegraph, the same engine room telegraph system used on ocean liners, adapted for the sky. It was hot in the engine cars. The Tornado diesels ran at tremendous temperatures, and the nacelles, though open to the air at one end, trapped heat and exhaust fumes. The smell was diesel fuel and hot metal and lubricating oil, a world away from the fresh bread and coffee of the dining room above. The engine cars swung slightly in the wind, adding a pendulum motion that the passenger accommodation never felt. The engineers' hands were permanently oil-stained. Their overalls were black with grease. It was these men, the engine car crews, who survived. 4 of the 6 survivors were in the nacelles when the ship went down. The hull above them burned, but the nacelles, slung below, were partly shielded. The oil and the grease and the heat had kept them alive while the white and gold panels and the Cambridge blue curtains and the air-filled cushions fed the fire. The wireless operators inhabited another isolated outpost, the radio room, forward of the passenger accommodation, equipped with Marconi transmitters and receivers. Arthur Disley was there on the final flight, maintaining the link between R101 and Cardington, between the ship and the world. It was Disley who, despite burns so severe he could barely grip, telephoned the Air Ministry from Beauvais before accepting treatment. The message had to get through. That was his training. That was his duty. And then there were the men in the control car, the nerve center of the ship, slung beneath the forward section of the hull. The captain, the watch officer, the height coxswain, the rudderman. They worked in a space smaller than a living room, surrounded by instruments, gauges, a large inclinometer, and the elevator and rudder controls. Through the windows of the control car, they could look down at the ground passing below, a view that was thrilling in good weather and terrifying in bad. The control car crew bore the ultimate responsibility for every second of flight. When the first dive came, it was the height coxswain, anonymous, unknown, his name lost because he did not survive, who hauled the elevator hard over and brought the ship back to level for those few precious seconds before the second dive took her down. We don't know his name. We know what he did. The crew of R101 were not passengers. They were not spectators. They were the muscle and nerve and bone of the ship. And most of them died doing exactly what they'd been trained to do. Their hands on the controls, their eyes on the gauges, their bodies braced in the dark spaces that passengers never saw and never thought about. 42 of the 54 aboard were crew or officials. 36 of them died. The youngest, Thomas Megginson, was 18. The oldest crew member to die was 49. Most were in their 30s, married men with families, living in Bedford and the surrounding villages, walking or cycling to work at the Royal Airship Works each morning, past the enormous shadow of the shed that held the ship they were building. They knew R101 better than anyone. They knew her weaknesses. Many of them had private doubts, and they went aboard on that October evening because that was the job, because their mates were going, because the ship was theirs. They had built her, flown her, repaired her, argued about her, worried about her. She was flawed and they knew it, but she was theirs. The invisible army, the men behind the panels, the hands that made the palace fly. They deserve to be remembered not as victims of a disaster, but as professionals who did extraordinary work under impossible conditions, and who went to their deaths with a competence and a courage that the white and gold corridors they built can only dimly reflect. There are two carpets in this story. One is Lord Thompson's, the 129-pound Persian rug he loaded aboard R101 alongside his champagne and his dress sword and his valet. We've talked about that one. It weighs as much as the toilets they removed. The other carpet is the one in the lounge. R101's original specifications called for thick carpeting throughout the passenger areas. Deep pile. The kind that silences footsteps and suggests permanence and wealth. The kind you'd find in a first-class railway carriage or a gentleman's club on Pall Mall. The kind that weighs, per square yard, considerably more than you'd think. The lounge alone was 5,500 square feet. Carpet that entire space, and you've added hundreds of pounds, weight the ship could not spare. Add the corridors, the dining room, the promenade decks, and you're talking about a significant fraction of a ton devoted to the experience of walking without hearing your own footsteps. They kept the carpet. They removed the toilets. This wasn't madness. It was something more interesting than madness. It was a choice, a deliberate, considered choice about what this ship was for. The engineers who stripped R101 of sleeping cabins and servo mechanisms and water ballast tanks understood perfectly well that every pound of luxury was a pound of safety margin. They calculated it, they documented it, they raised objections through proper channels, and they were overruled because R101 was not merely a flying machine. She was a statement of intent, a projection of imperial power, a symbol of what Britain could achieve. A ship that arrived in India without a proper dining room, without a lounge, without promenade decks and curtains and carpeted floors. That ship would have been an embarrassment. It would have confirmed every doubt about the government's ability to match private enterprise. It would have made the whole programme look cut-rate, second-class, unworthy of the empire it was meant to serve. So the carpet stayed and the toilets went. And this is where R101's story becomes something larger than an aviation disaster. Because the tension between what a thing needs to be and what powerful people want it to look like, that tension didn't die in a field near Beauvais. It's alive today in every project where schedule overrides safety, where appearance overrides function, where the people who understand the engineering are overruled by the people who understand the politics. The dining room didn't doom R101 by itself. No single decision did. It was the accumulation. The dining room and the carpet and the promenade windows and the smoking room and the lounge and the heavy engines and the rushed schedule and the political pressure and the ignored warnings and the unfinished testing and the insufficient trials. Each decision taken alone was arguably defensible. Taken together, they crushed the ship's margins to nothing and sent 54 people into the sky aboard a vessel that had no room for error on a night that was full of it. Lord Thompson wanted to ride the storm. He loaded his carpet and his champagne, and he rode it. The engineers wanted to keep the passengers' carpeted floor. They kept it, and they stripped the ballast tanks and the toilets and the sleeping berths and the servo systems, and they must have hoped that the margins would hold. They didn't hold. They couldn't hold. And the reasons they couldn't hold were right there underfoot, in the soft pile of a carpet that no one could bear to remove. There is a coda to this story, and it may be the cruelest part of all. R100 worked. She had crossed the Atlantic twice. She had flown to Montreal in 78 hours and come home even faster. 100,000 Canadians a day had queued to see her. Her framework, designed by Barnes-Wallis, was elegant and sound. Her Rolls-Royce engines ran reliably. Her gas bags held. Her crew had confidence in her. Neville Shute, who had computed her stress loads by hand over months and years of painstaking work, knew she was safe because he had made her safe. Calculation by calculation, girder by girder, number by number. R100 was the proof that British airship travel could work. She was the answer to every skeptic, every critic, every doubt. If R101 had never existed, if the government had simply let Vickers build the fleet, as Denistone Burney had originally proposed, R100 might have been the first of a generation of airships that carried the Empire's passengers and mail across the world in quiet, spacious comfort. Instead, they crushed her. After the R101 disaster, the Cardington programme was immediately suspended. R100 was walked back into her shed at Howden and sat there in the dark through the winter of 1930 and the spring and summer of 1931, while the inquiry ran its course and the government decided what to do. On August 31st, 1931, the Cabinet formally abandoned British airship development. The decision was total. There would be no modifications, no further trials, no attempt to salvage what 100 Rand had proven. The programme was dead, and everything associated with it would be erased. R100 was deflated. Her gas bags, those same gold beaters' skin cells made from the same ox membranes, assembled with the same painstaking care, were emptied and removed. Her framework was dismantled, section by section, and then, in an act that seems almost vindictive in its thoroughness, the girders were laid out on the ground and flattened by steamrollers. Steamrollers! The airframe that Barnes-Wallis had designed with the precision of a watchmaker, that Neville Shute had stress-tested through thousands of hours of hand calculations, was run over by road paving equipment until it was flat enough to sell as scrap metal. The price? Less than £600, for a ship that had cost £450,000 to build. Shute was devastated. He wrote about it in Slide Rule, the memoir he published in 1954, more than 2 decades later, and the anger still burns on every page. Not raging anger. Shute was not a man who raged, but a cold, clear, moral fury at the waste of it. The waste of the ship, the waste of the knowledge, the waste of the years of work by hundreds of people who had got it right, who had built something that flew, who had proven their case, and who were punished for another team's failure. There is a particular cruelty in being right, and having it not matter. R100's success should have been vindication. Instead, it was erased. The government couldn't keep 100 Rand flying. because 101 Rand had killed the idea of airships in the public mind, and they couldn't let 100 Rand sit in her shed as a monument to the superiority of private enterprise over state management. Not with a Labour government in power, not with the political dimensions of the competition still raw and painful. So R100 was destroyed. Not because she was dangerous, not because she was flawed, because she was inconvenient. Because her existence asked a question that no one in power wanted to answer. The Zeppelin Company, watching from Germany, purchased 5 tons of duralumin from the scrapped British airships. The metal was shipped across the Channel and incorporated into new projects. Whether any of it ended up in the Hindenburg, the great German airship that would burn at Lakehurst, New Jersey, on May 6, 1937, in front of newsreel cameras and a horrified world, is a matter of persistent rumour rather than verified fact. But there is something haunting in the possibility. The metal of a British airship, crushed by steamrollers and sold for scrap, rising again inside a German airship that would meet its own fiery end 7 years later. Barnes-Wallis went on to design the Wellington bomber and the bouncing bomb. His name became one of the most famous in British engineering history. Neville Shute wrote novels that sold millions of copies and captured the quiet heroism of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And anyone who reads No Highway, his 1948 novel about an aircraft engineer who discovers a fatal flaw that no one will believe, can hear the echo of R101 in every chapter. The knowledge died. That's the thing that matters most, and that's the thing that's hardest to see. When 100 Rand was crushed, and 101 Rand's wreckage was sold for scrap, Britain didn't just lose 2 airships, it lost 20 years of accumulated knowledge about lighter-than-air flight, the stress calculations, the gas bag technology, the handling techniques, the hard-won understanding of how these enormous machines behaved in weather and wind and darkness. All of it gone, all of it scattered. Germany kept flying. The Graf Zeppelin made 590 flights and carried more than 13,000 passengers without a single injury. The Hindenburg, despite its famous end, completed 63 successful flights before Lakehurst. The Germans had learned that airships worked. If you respected what they were, if you didn't overload them with political ambition or imperial vanity, if you let the engineers have the final word, Britain never flew an airship again. The sheds at Cardington stand empty of airships now, enormous, echoing spaces where movies are made and echoes carry. The memorial in the churchyard holds its 48 names in stone, and 100 Rand, the ship that worked, the ship that flew, the ship that proved the dream was possible. 100 Rand exists now only in photographs, in Neville Shute's memoir, and in the calculations of a young stress engineer who sat at a desk in Yorkshire and got every number right. She deserved better. They all did.